Hey everyone, and welcome to my channel. The following is presented to you in the form of an audiobook. I want to start today with something that might sound a bit crazy, like really crazy, but bear with me, okay? Right now, as you're watching this video, you're probably sitting somewhere, maybe on a couch, maybe at your desk, and you can see the screen in front of you, maybe hear some background noise around you. But here's the wild question that's been keeping philosophers up at night for centuries. What if none of that is actually real? What if the chair you're sitting on, the device you're watching this on, even your own body, what if it's all just happening in your mind? I know, it sounds totally insane, but stick with me here. Because today we're diving into one of the most mind-bending questions in all of philosophy. Is reality fundamentally mental or physical in nature? And trust me, this isn't just some random philosophical thought experiment that has no bearing on real life. This question cuts right to the very core of what it means to exist, what it means to be conscious, and how we should even begin to understand our place in this vast universe. For thousands of years, brilliant minds have been wrestling with whether the world is made up of physical stuff, like atoms, molecules, energy, all governed by the laws of physics, or whether everything we experience is actually mental, existing primarily in consciousness, in our minds, or maybe in some universal mind. This is what philosophers call metaphysics, the branch of philosophy that deals with the fundamental nature of reality itself. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Okay, this is way too abstract. Why does this even matter? But here's the thing. How you answer this question shapes absolutely everything else you believe. If reality is fundamentally physical, then we might be nothing more than incredibly complex biological machines. And everything we do, our thoughts, our emotions, our choices, is the result of physical processes happening in our brains. But if reality is fundamentally mental, then consciousness isn't just a byproduct of brain activity. It might actually be the very foundation of existence itself. And that's a huge difference. So yes, we're going to explore both sides of this debate. We're going to look at the strongest arguments for each position. And by the end, I want you to tell me in the comments, what do you think reality is? Let's start with what's probably the more familiar view for most of us living in the modern world, physicalism, sometimes also called materialism. This is the idea that everything that exists is fundamentally physical. When physicalists look at the world, they see matter and energy, particles and forces, all governed by the laws of physics and chemistry and biology. From this perspective, even the most complex things we can imagine, human consciousness, emotions, creativity, love, are all ultimately the result of physical processes happening in our brains. Think about it this way. Physicalists would say that when you feel happy, that's not some mysterious mental state floating around independently. Nope, it's the result of specific chemicals like dopamine and serotonin interacting with neurons in your brain in very specific ways. When you have a thought, it's because electrical signals are firing across neural pathways. When you make a decision, it's because the physical structure of your brain, shaped by genetics and experience, is processing information and producing an output. It's kind of like thinking of your brain as an incredibly sophisticated computer. The hardware is what's really doing all the work, and what we call mind or consciousness is just the software running on that hardware. And look, this view has some pretty compelling evidence behind it. Modern neuroscience has shown us again and again that changes to the brain produce changes in consciousness and behavior. If someone suffers a brain injury, their personality might change dramatically. If you take certain drugs that affect brain chemistry, your entire experience of reality can shift. We can even stimulate specific parts of the brain with electrodes and make people see things that aren't there, or remember things that never happened. That seems to suggest that consciousness really is just a product of physical brain processes. And this physicalist tradition goes way back. Ancient Greek philosophers like Democritus proposed that everything in the universe is made up of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms moving around in empty space. And modern physicalists like philosopher Daniel Dennett argue that consciousness is essentially an illusion, a very convincing one, but an illusion nonetheless. From this perspective, there's no mysterious inner life or what it's like to be conscious. There's just complex information processing happening in physical systems. But here's where it gets interesting, and where the physicalist view starts to run into some serious problems. There's this thing that philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Even if we can explain all the physical processes happening in the brain, there's still this nagging question. Why is there any subjective experience at all? Why does it feel like something to be you when you see the color red? Sure, we can measure light waves of a certain frequency hitting your retina, and we can track the electrical signals going to your visual cortex, but none of that explains why you have the actual experience of seeing red, that qualitative, subjective aspect of consciousness. What philosophers call qualia seems to be something over and above all the physical processes. And this brings us to the other side of our philosophical debate, idealism. Now, before you click away thinking this is going to be too abstract and weird, let me tell you that idealism actually makes a lot more sense than you might initially think. The basic idea is that reality is fundamentally mental in nature. Instead of consciousness being produced by physical matter, idealists argue that matter, if it exists at all, depends on consciousness for its existence. The most famous idealist philosopher was George Berkeley, an 18th century Irish bishop who came up with the slogan, "To be is to be perceived." And Berkeley's argument was actually pretty straightforward when you think about it. Everything you know about the external world comes through your senses, right? You see colors, you hear sounds, you feel textures, but those sensations exist in your mind. You never actually encounter matter directly. You only encounter your ideas or perceptions of matter. So how can you ever prove that there's a physical world existing independently of your mind? Just think about this for a second. When you look at a tree, what are you actually experiencing? You're experiencing the visual sensation of green and brown, maybe the sound of leaves rustling, perhaps the smell of bark, but all of those are mental experiences. You never experience the tree itself, only your mental representation of it. And so Berkeley argued that it makes no logical sense to assume there's some mysterious material substance called matter existing behind these experiences. Why not just say that reality consists of minds and their ideas? Now, Berkeley wasn't saying that you're creating the entire world with your individual mind, because that would lead to some pretty crazy consequences like other people disappearing when you're not thinking about them. Instead, he argued that all of our experiences are ideas in the mind of God. God is constantly perceiving everything, which is why the world seems stable and consistent even when we're not paying attention to it. When you leave your room and come back, your furniture is still there because God never stopped perceiving it. I know, this might sound completely bizarre to modern ears, but idealism actually deals with some serious philosophical problems that physicalism struggles with. For one thing, it completely sidesteps the hard problem of consciousness. If reality is fundamentally mental, then consciousness isn't some mysterious property that somehow emerges from dead matter. It's the basic building block of everything that exists. Idealism also handles the problem of perception really elegantly. We know that what we perceive isn't always what's really there. Optical illusions, dreams, hallucinations. These show us that our minds can create vivid, convincing experiences that don't correspond to any external physical reality. So if our minds can do that, how do we know that our normal waking experience is any different? Maybe what we call reality is just a very persistent, very consistent dream or mental construct. And you know what? There are even some interesting connections between idealism and modern physics. Quantum mechanics has shown us that at the fundamental level, reality seems to be quite different from our everyday experience of solid, separate objects. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality, that particles don't have definite properties until they're observed. Now, I want to be careful here because this is often misunderstood and oversimplified, but it's interesting that our best physical theories are raising questions about the relationship between mind and matter that sound surprisingly similar to what idealist philosophers have been saying for centuries. So we have these two radically different views of reality. Physicalism says everything is ultimately matter and energy, following physical laws, and consciousness is just what complex physical processes feel like from the inside. Idealism says everything is ultimately mental, and what we call the physical world is really just patterns of experience or ideas in minds. Both views have their strengths, and both face serious challenges. The strength of physicalism is that it aligns with our scientific understanding of the world. Science has been incredibly successful at explaining and predicting natural phenomena by treating everything as physical processes. We can cure diseases by understanding the physical chemistry of the body. We can build computers by manipulating the physical properties of matter. We can send rockets to Mars by calculating physical forces and trajectory. This suggests that physical reality is more than just an illusion or mental construct. But physicalism really struggles with consciousness. Despite decades of neuroscience research, we still don't have a convincing explanation for why there's any subjective experience at all. We can map brain states to mental states, sure, but the gap between neurons firing and experiencing the taste of chocolate still seems unbridgeable. Some physicalists just bite the bullet and say consciousness is an illusion, but that seems to ignore the most obvious and undeniable aspect of our existence, the fact that we are conscious. The strength of idealism is that it takes consciousness seriously as a fundamental feature of reality, rather than trying to explain it away. It also deals elegantly with all the problems of perception and the relationship between mind and world. But idealism faces its own serious challenges. If reality is fundamentally mental, why does it seem so consistent and law-governed? Why can't I just decide that gravity doesn't apply to me and start flying around? Why does the world seem to exist independently of my thoughts and wishes? Berkeley's answer was God. There's a universal mind that maintains the consistency and lawfulness of experience. But that's a pretty big metaphysical commitment that not everyone is willing to make. Modern idealists have proposed other solutions. Some argue for a kind of cosmic consciousness or universal mind that we're all part of. Others suggest that the laws of nature are really laws of thought or logic rather than physical laws. There are also some interesting hybrid positions that try to combine the insights of both physicalism and idealism. Panpsychism, for example, suggests that consciousness is a fundamental property of all matter, not just complex brains. On this view, even electrons and quarks have some minimal form of experience or consciousness. This would explain how consciousness can emerge from matter. It doesn't emerge, it's been there all along, just getting more complex as matter organizes into more complex systems, like brains. Another interesting position is dual aspect theory, which suggests that mind and matter are two aspects of the same underlying reality, kind of like how a coin has two sides but is really one object. From this perspective, physical processes and mental processes aren't two different things. They're two different ways of describing the same underlying events. Now you might be wondering, does any of this actually matter for how we live our lives? I think it absolutely does. If you believe reality is fundamentally physical, you might focus on scientific and technological solutions to human problems. You might see consciousness as a fascinating but ultimately explainable product of evolution. You might believe that understanding the brain will eventually allow us to understand and control all aspects of human experience. But if you believe reality is fundamentally mental, you might place more emphasis on consciousness-based practices like meditation, mindfulness, or psychotherapy. You might be more open to the possibility that consciousness can influence physical reality in ways that mainstream science doesn't yet understand. You might see the development of consciousness and wisdom as more important than technological progress. These aren't just abstract philosophical differences. They shape how we approach education, medicine, psychology, and even ethics and politics. They influence whether we see human beings as complex machines that can be fixed through the right physical interventions, or as conscious beings whose inner experience is the most important aspect of their existence. I also think this question connects to some of the biggest challenges facing our species right now. If consciousness is just an illusion produced by brain chemistry, then maybe artificial intelligence will eventually surpass human intelligence, and consciousness won't be special anymore. But if consciousness is fundamental to reality, then the development of human wisdom and understanding might be more important than we realize. The truth is, despite thousands of years of philosophical debate and centuries of scientific investigation, we still don't have a definitive answer to whether reality is fundamentally mental or physical. Maybe that's because the question itself is based on a false dichotomy. Maybe reality is neither purely mental nor purely physical, but something more complex and subtle that we haven't fully grasped yet. What I find most fascinating is that this question forces us to confront the deepest mysteries of existence. Whether you lean toward physicalism or idealism, you have to grapple with profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and world, and what it means to exist. These aren't just academic puzzles. They're central to understanding who we are and our place in the universe. So here's what I want to know from you. After thinking through these arguments, do you lean more toward physicalism or idealism? Do you think reality is fundamentally made of matter and energy, with consciousness emerging from complex physical processes? Or do you think consciousness is more fundamental, with what we call the physical world depending on minds for its existence? Or maybe you think there's a third option that combines or transcends both views. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and I love hearing your perspectives on these big questions. And if this video got you thinking about the nature of reality in a new way, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into philosophy and consciousness. I'm planning to explore questions like whether free will exists, what the meaning of life might be, and how we can know if other people are actually conscious or just very convincing philosophical zombies. The great thing about philosophy is that even when we don't find definitive answers, the process of thinking deeply about these questions changes how we see ourselves and the world. Whether reality turns out to be mental, physical, or something else entirely, the fact that we can even ask these questions and think deeply about them might be the most remarkable thing about existence itself. Thanks for joining me on this philosophical journey, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll tackle another one of life's biggest mysteries.